It would have been much easier to arrange the migration paths of the early fraternities had the event stopped here. But to complicate the issue, the Indian origin fraternities preferred to return to India, which is referred to in this book as the process of reverse migration. They came back for various reasons, a conflict between the matriarchal and patriarchal fraternities initiating the process. As Christianity and Islam emerged in the Middle East, followers of Hinduism returned to their homeland because of religious persecution. Settlement of various reverse migration fraternities from different regions resulted in an admixture of genetic identities in different corners of India. Thus today, India has a very complex genetic composition of onward and reverse migration fraternities. It is extremely important that we understand the embryological process and manage to arrange the entire sequence of events of the migration of the various genetic identities during different periods. Otherwise, it would remain impossible for us to understand the complex findings of every genetic study conducted involving the Indian population. At this juncture, we have to consider that AMH, or anatomically modern humans, scientifically known as Homo sapiens, originated in Africa about 200,000 years or 2 lakh years ago. They arrived in India about 65,000 years ago following their out of Africa move. They possibly followed a southern route known as the Great Coastal Migration. Though there are many theories regarding the early migration of AMH, this is the most accepted view. In all probability, anatomically modern humans reached Andamans from the Bengal-Myanmar coast. They continued their eastward journey farther all the way to Australia. It is possible that India served as the intermediate host of anatomically modern humans, and our ancestors continuously lived in India for 65,000 years. They reached Europe much later, about 45 to 50,000 years ago, possibly from India during an interglacial period. Anatomically modern humans could survive in India during both the glacial and interglacial periods because of availability of favorable terrains. During the glacial period, they lived in south of Vindhya Parbat, the green territory in the map, in eastern, central and southern India, while during the interglacial period, they also spread to northern and western India, the blue territory in the map. The presence of a large number of dark complexioned tribes in India suggests the continuous survival of anatomically modern humans here. Absence of any such human diversity in Europe and rest of Asia suggests the spread of anatomically modern humans in these regions only during the interglacial periods. Though AMH reached Europe and northern Asia during every interglacial period, they could not survive there due to severe weather of glacial maximum and became extinct. We have evidences of extinction of Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Siberia 40,000 years ago during a previous glacial maximum. It is possible that Indian origin people spread to other regions of Asia and Europe during the interglacial period once the trans-Himalayan migration was possible. Let us try to understand what has emerged at the Indian end following a number of genetic studies involving Indian population. A very interesting genetic finding regarding Indian population has emerged in the recent times, which needs a serious consideration. Indian population north of Vindhya Parbat has been found to have a genetic composition which is completely different from that of the population settled in the south of it. This has been claimed by a group of geneticists following a widespread study and has been published in a reputed scientific journal. This is rather unusual, considering that this mountain range extending from east to west in central India has an insignificant height. This was in no way a barrier to restrict the movement of the population from north to south or from south to north. The genetic division of the people living north of Vindhya Parbat has been termed as Ancestral North Indian or ANI, and those living on the south of the range as ancestral South Indian or ASI in a recently published scientific paper. It is not understood how the genetic identity of Andaman Aboriginal tribes matches with the ASI genetic identity when this region never got physically connected with the Andaman archipelago. The anthropological fraternities living north and south of the Vindhya Parbat are distinctly different. It compels us to consider the origin of the pre- and post-glacial period genetic identities during the glacial period on the Bengal-Myanmar coast. Presently, it is said that the ancestral North Indian population have a genetic identity which primarily matches with the genetic identity of Western and Central Asia and Europe. In fact, because of this finding, it is believed that North Indians have a close connectivity with these regions and they might have come from there. Incidentally, this line of thinking matches with the concept of Indo-Aryan invasion from the west to India. However, as per the Indo-Aryan invasion hypothesis, only a small number of people had come from the west referred to as Aryans. Majority of the existing population were indigenous. In all probability, the Aryan invaders were at the most 5 to 7% of the total North Indian population. This small number of invaders could not have completely altered the genetic composition of the entire North Indian population, as majority of them were indigenous. Moreover, indigenous people were placed at the bottom of the caste system like Shudro, while the Indo-Aryans occupied the higher status like Brahmins and Kshatriyas. This handful of higher caste people determined the rules of the society, keeping every such rule blatantly tilting in their favor, which can be seen even now. In fact, social division of the caste system was so rigid that intercaste marriage was not accepted. Thus, it is not rational to consider the flow of genetic identity from higher caste to lower caste population. Finally, the geneticists have confirmed that lower caste and higher caste population essentially have been detected to have similar genetic identities except minor alterations. This confirms that the indigenous lower caste people and reverse migration higher caste fraternities had the same origin. It also confirms that the higher caste people or the Indo-Aryans are the reverse migration Indian fraternities from the west, and thus they have similar genetic identities. It appears that indigenous R1 alpha haplogroup people traveled to Europe 5,800 years ago. They were dark complexion who settled in Europe. In all probability, Kali was their mother goddess who with time manifested there as Black Madonna. These Indian origin fraternities started returning from Europe since 4,000 years ago. This phenomena is now referred to as the Indo-Aryan migration. They established themselves as the higher caste Brahmins and Kshatriyas in the caste system. If Indo-Aryans or higher caste people had originated and come from the west, they would have brought a new genetic identity to India. That did not happen. Both lower and higher caste people were found to have similar genetic identity. The reverse migration fraternities from Europe who occupied the highest status in the caste system as Brahmins and Kshatriyas designated the reverse migration fraternities from Egypt as intermediate caste. They were referred to as Vaishyas and were placed between the higher caste Brahmin and Kshatriyas and lower caste Shudras. The observation of two distinct genetic divisions in the north and south of Vindhya Parbat needs a scientific explanation. Unfortunately, this genetic finding disclosed in scientific journals about a decade ago has not received adequate global attention which it should have received. It can only be explained by the origin of the pre- and post-glacial period genetic identities during the glacial period on the Bengal-Myanmar coast. The origin of the post-glacial period newer genetic identities like the R1 alpha and R1 bravo on the Bengal glacial coastal shelf explains this phenomena. This resulted in the occupation of the pre-glacial period genetic identities south of the Vindhya Parbat and post-glacial period genetic identities north of the Vindhya Parbat. It appears that ancestral North Indian territory demarcated by the geneticist corresponds with the post-glacial period settlement area and the ancestral South Indian territory corresponds with the pre-glacial period settlement area. We also have to understand what happened in northern India during the last glacial period. We have to delve deeper into the behavioral changes of the rivers of the entire northern India to understand the phenomena. Only then we would be able to fathom why only the territory north of Vindhya Parvat exhibits post-glacial period genetic identities. In other words, why did the post-glacial period people essentially settle in northern India? It is important to appreciate that the entire northern India is the catchment area of a number of rivers fed by the snow-melted glacial waters of the Himalayas. During the last glacial period, there was no melting of Himalayan snow, and thus the rivers of the region became completely dry. Glacial period tentatively lasted for about 10,000 years when the Himalayan region got totally covered with frozen snow. During this period, northern India became unsuitable for human habitation and the area became devoid of human settlements. During the interglacial period, as the Himalayan snow started melting because of the rise in the global temperature, the rivers started flowing again, making the region fertile and suitable for human habitation. For this reason, only during the interglacial period, like the present period, northern India becomes suitable for human settlements. Hence, post-glacial period populations settle in this region. Northern India, including the Himalayan region, is thus referred to as the Temporary Settlement Zone of India, or TSZI, in this book. This is marked as the blue zone in the map. Incidentally, there are references in our ancient texts where it is mentioned that the river Ganga descended from Kailash mountains to the Bay of Bengal. On the other hand, the area south of the Vindhya Parvat is scattered with rivers which do not originate from the Himalayas. They flow even during the glacial period when the rivers of the Himalayas get dried up. Thus, human settlement continues in this region of India during both the glacial and the interglacial periods. This region south of the Vindhya is thus referred to as the Permanent Settlement Zone of India, or PSZI. This region serves as the settlement of the pre-glacial as well as the post-glacial period population of India. This zone is marked as green territory in the map. The onset of the last interglacial period caused melting of the snow in the north and south poles, resulting in a worldwide rise of seawater. These rise of seawater caused displacement of the fraternities settled on the Bengal glacial coastal shelf, forcing them to migrate towards the mainland. They settled on the permanent settlement zone of the Bengal coast and also on the vacant areas of the temporary settlement zone in northern India. Finally, many of them migrated along the rivers of the Himalayas to distant lands like the Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Europe. Thus, the post-glacial period genetic identity R1 alpha haplogroup in the Y chromosome essentially settled in northern India. This region eventually accommodated both the onward migration and the reverse migration post-glacial period genetic identities. As the reverse migration fraternities returned from Western and Central Asia and Europe, North Indian genetic composition today shows similarity with these distant regions. This genetic composition has been identified as the ancestral North Indian genetic division by the geneticist in a recent study. The Gangetic plains once again became fertile as the Himalayan rivers started flowing due to melting of snow at the onset of the interglacial period. It is extremely interesting to note that the reverse migration fraternities established majority of the Mahajanapadas in this fertile but vacant land north of the Vindhya Parvat. This fertile land was still available for settlement as the pre-glacial period fraternities were hunter-gatherers and they remained settled in the permanent settlement zone south of the Vindhyas. Similarly, both onward and reverse migration fraternities settled in the vacant lands along the Uttara Path, which served as the principal highway of the Trans-Himalayan migration. This region extended from Afghanistan in the west to the Tibetan Plateau and Southeast Asia in the east. Two of the Mahajanapadas, namely Kamboja and Gandhara, emerged on the west of this region. On the other hand, pre-glacial period genetic fraternities settled south of the Vindhya Parvat have a completely different genetic identity, and this is identified as the ancestral South Indian genetic division by the geneticists. As the land bridge between the Bengal-Myanmar coast and the Andaman archipelago formed during the glacial period, only pre-glacial period population could enter the archipelago. Thus, Andaman population is found to have more similarity with the ancestral South Indian genetic division. There is one more important issue which needs to be settled regarding the site of origin of the newer genetic identities like the R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in the Y chromosome. It has been estimated that these genetic identities originated around 25,000 years ago. We find archaeological sites of Europe are only 9,000 years old. If we stick to the present view that these newer genetic identities originated in the European steppe and Anatolia, then it becomes difficult to explain this period gap where they took 16,000 years to reach rest of Europe from European steppe. Moreover, archaeological sites of Göbekli Tepe and Natufian culture have emerged in the meantime, which are 12 to 14,000 years old and are located in the southeast Turkey and on the Mediterranean coast, much to the east of Europe. In this case also, they took 10,000 years to reach eastern Mediterranean coast from their site of origin in the European steppe. Thus, these recent findings do not match with the period of origin of the newer genetic identities and their direction of movement. On the other hand, it is possible that these newer genetic identities originated on the Bengal coast during the last glacial period when the coastal landmass emerged around 25,000 years ago. They migrated only when their settlement started submerging around 12 to 14,000 years ago at the onset of the interglacial period. On their way to the Mediterranean coast and Europe, they established Gulf of Khambhat cultural complex, Mehergarh, Natufian culture, Göbekli Tepe, and settled in similar other ancient sites. Thereafter, they reached Anatolia and European steppe to enter Europe. If we consider this view, then the present genetic observations and archaeological findings match in a more acceptable manner. We have to keep in mind that India is a unique territory in many ways. It has territories where anatomical modern humans survived both during the glacial and interglacial periods. One needs to appreciate the unique nature of the Bengal coast where newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo originated. One also has to understand that northern India remains suitable for human settlement only during the interglacial period. This resulted in pre- and post-glacial genetic identities settled in two halves of India. Majority of the scholars believe that anatomically modern humans reached India 65,000 years ago following their out of Africa move and great coastal migration. India served as the intermediate host where anatomical modern humans lived continuously for this entire period. During every interglacial period, the anatomically modern humans spread to the rest of Eurasia, but they got extinct during the subsequent glacial maximum. Present population reached Eurasia during the last interglacial period when newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo spread there from India in the last 10,000 years. India needs a special attention of the global scholars to understand the process of early migration of anatomically modern humans all over the major parts of the world.